So I'm Bob Ferguson. I'm joined by Ken Prichard, who of course was Wing Luke's campaign manager when Wing Luke ran for city council many years ago now. And it's a real honor to have a chance to chat with you. I'm a big admirer of Wing Luke for a lot of reasons. So I've read a lot about you, and it's great to have a chance to chat. So thanks for being here.
Very good.
And we're here on the day after an election here in Seattle, actually. So today's November 6th. We had an election yesterday. And one thing I was thinking about as I drove down was they passed down at SeaTac the $15 minimum wage.
I was amazed.
Yeah.
I was amazed. I highly approve of it, I might add. But it's little communities like that that can do it. And,
Absolutely.
And they did it.
Absolutely.
And,
did Wing Luke have any thoughts on minimum wage or issues related to that at all?
oh, he may have, but we didn't talk about it.
Got it. Fair enough. Well, one reason I've always been interested in politics in Seattle and the state of Washington, and since becoming Attorney General, there was one thing I wanted to ask about. I wasn't sure if you had any thoughts about it, but we've done some research back in our office, in the Office of Attorney General, and Wing Luke, as I understand it, spent several years working as an Assistant Attorney General in our office.
He did indeed.
Excellent.
In the office down near the waterfront.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. And so you, of course, knew him during that time period, is that right?
Oh, I sure did.
Yes.
And one of the people in that office was Judge Faith Enyart Ireland's mother.
Is that right?
And we got very close. As a matter of fact, when Faith was, I think, her 18th birthday or something like that, Wig and I took her to the Space Needle for lunch, and been involved with her for years and
No
years
kidding.
and years.
So just if I was tracking that, you're saying Justice Ireland's mother worked in the AG's office at the same time as Wing Luke, is that right?
Yeah.
I just was actually, I was at an event, I think it was Seattle University Law School I was speaking at, and I was speaking out Wing Luke. I brought up Wing Luke for some reason. I forget the context of why I brought up Wing Luke, but I was speaking about him, and Faith Ireland was in the audience. And she raised her hand and had something to add about Wing Luke as well. So I realized she was someone who followed him closely, but I did not realize the
She knew him as a teenager.
Interesting.
And, so we've known her as a little girl. And now she's a big, strong woman.
Yes, she is. Yes, she is. And so during his time there, I think he worked in our office for 4 or 5 years, if I understand correctly. Does that sound about right to you?
I think so, yeah.
Yes. And did you, just curious, just did you have much conversation about his work there? Why he was interested maybe in working for the state AG's office? Did you have recall any conversations about his time as an Assistant Attorney General?
Very, very little. And the reason is I was a travel agent, and I spent an enormous amount of time at that particular time at various places overseas, mostly in Europe. And so I missed out on a lot of those things. In fact, the big case that people keep talking about, the discrimination in the University District, the Unitarian Church, and all, I missed out on that completely.
Okay.
But I had a group of the lawyers that were involved with that. We're over at the old museum, and we had a little meeting together. There's only one left of that group now.
And who's that?
Byron Coney.
Okay.
And Byron is probably the best person in the world to talk about it, because he's, first of all, articulate, and he's still got everything going in his head.
Great.
And Marvin Durning was another one, but Marvin died.
And Byron's last name, how do you spell Byron's last name?
C-O-N-E-Y.
Great. And I will track him down because everybody in our office is very interested in Wing Luke's time as an Assistant Attorney General. Do you know if he was the first Asian American to work as an Assistant Attorney General in our office?
He was.
And that's what I've heard from others, is they're sure he was. We haven't been able
I can't
to confirm
imagine who else it would be. Warren wouldn't have been old enough to do that.
I was chatting with yesterday with former State Supreme Court Justice Charles Smith.
Oh, yes.
Who went to law school with Wing Luke, apparently.
That's right, and they were very close, and he's one of my favorite people, too.
Interesting. And is there anyone, in terms of the legal community, folks who are around today who would have gone to law school with Wing Luke or perhaps worked with him in the AG's office in those early years of his career? Who
Not
might
that
still
I
be-
know of. Charles would be the one that I
Right.
would think of immediately.
Right.
But there were others, but I think they're all gone. We're all getting old.
That's not true. You're doing extremely well. So so I did want to ask you a little bit about. I've read the interview you had with Mr. Chu, which is an excellent interview.
That was marvelous. I
Yes.
was quite amazed.
And you said that was in 1991 that you had that interview, and you've had a chance to go back and take a look at that. Is that correct?
I did just the other day.
And was there anything? Was there
First day I even knew it existed.
Oh, is that right? Okay. And in going back and taking a look at that, I'm going to ask some follow-up questions about
Yeah.
that interview. And but just before I do that, just was curious in reading that interview, was there anything that struck you that you wish you'd added or wanted to mention based on your reading of that interview?
No, as a matter of fact, that's what amazed me at how comprehensive it really was. It kept going on and
Yes.
on. And,
Yes.
I remember having the interview, but, and it's not well recorded because there's a lot of errors in it and so forth. In fact, I'd like to talk to Ron and have him put it back together into
You bet.
real shape.
You bet.
Because it has things in it that I think are important to the museum,
Absolutely.
the community generally, and to politics.
I think what the level of detail you provide in that interview, I thought was fantastic. To have that level of recall around specific issues or incidents that were happening at that time, I thought was fascinating. And one thing I did want to ask a little bit about is, having run for office myself, I'm always curious about the decision to actually run for an office. And I know you talked about this a little bit with Mr. Chu, but I want to talk a little more about, that's okay, that when you and Wing first discussed the possibility of him running for the city council, and perhaps you could just talk a little bit about that, and I may have some follow-up questions if that's okay.
Yeah, there's something else that I wrote that I couldn't find for you, and that I will find it eventually and send it to you. The actual circumstances of actually making the decision finally is such a romantic idea and so silly in a way, but it is absolutely true. We had talked about this at various times. I had gone to Mexico for a trip and routed myself back through Washington, D.C. because Wing was there at some sort of a Baptist convention or other. And we decided that we were going to make the decision for him to run. And so we went down to Williamsburg and holed up in a tavern down there, wonderful old place, and had a wonderful old meal. And
Was it just the two of you?
Just the two of us. And we put things together. However, I had done a lot of background work. My theory always was that if you're going to run for an office, you ought to have a pretty good idea that you're going to win. There's no point in playing around and trying to, make a statement and all that sort of thing. And so I tried to figure out who would it be in this community that would vote for a Chinese, for example, for such an office. And then I began to realize that Wing had this incredible background. He joined practically every good organization in town. He was a member of, or many of the organizations, he was on the board and this sort of thing. And I began to realize that everybody that was on those boards, or most of them, would have liked Wing and would have had a high opinion of him. And I began to top these things up, the different ones that would support him. And my final figures were that he was going to be a shoo-in.
Interesting.
And, and of course, that was our premise, but I ran scared all the way.
That's the right way to do it, right?
Right. But I never had any personal doubt that this community, first of all, being Chinese was the greatest asset he could have had. And that was totally opposed to everything the old politicians said. No, he's a foreigner and so forth. In fact, they wanted him to never have his picture taken. because that would reveal that he was Chinese. Because Wing is a good Scandinavian name, and Luke is as Scandinavian as you can get. And I said, no.
So there are folks like truly friends of Luke or advisors of Wing Luke who thought he should not have a photograph out there.
It's almost 100%.
Interesting. How did he feel about that?
As a matter of fact, the good liberals that were our friends were as racist as anybody else. They, or at least they didn't believe themselves to be, but fundamentally they didn't believe in it. And I, on the other hand, fundamentally did believe in it. But anyway, I was convinced that the Chinese had a great name in this community, partly because of the war. We were all Kuomintang then, and Chiang Kai-shek was a big guy. And so I thought that the community would like to have a Chinese.
And how did Wing Luke feel about his chances? Now, I'm talking before the campaign really started. So when you're at the bar, for example, having a beer, talking about the potential campaign, at that point in time, how confident do you think he felt about his chances?
He was always confident in anything he did. Because he was a politician, he started off in school. We knew him, or my wife knew him all the way from the first grade all the way through. And he was always the kid that was going to do it and would do it.
Interesting.
And this is why he and I hit it off so well, because I believed that anything I thought was right, I should see to it that it was brought to bear, and I figured Wiggy was just the one to do it.
Now, how old were you when you were having that beer back east, talking about the campaign? How old would you have been at that time?
32, probably.
Okay. And so did you write out a campaign plan for the campaign? Was there a written campaign plan?
No.
Okay.
I don't think so. Campaigns and what you did during the campaign was just a part of what I knew. Sure. And I didn't need any plans.
Had you worked on campaigns?
We had all sorts of people that coming around and wanting to offer help, real so-called professionals and so forth.
Right.
And I thought they were all wrong. The help that we were offered from the Senator Jackson's office, for example, was totally worthless. First of all, I don't think Jackson's people knew much about politics because he was such a shoo-in. He didn't need any help. And so we had an entirely different picture. The idea was to build this campaign here in Chinatown. This is where, at Chunghwa was where we really started things. We had a campaign school. I thought I brought a curriculum here of that. But the idea was to get everybody that was interested in the campaign to come in, and we would give them the background and et cetera, et cetera. And that grew out of a school, well, it was a political school that I did at the university. And that's where I really met Wing, because he was president of the YMCA and so forth. And I came in and I had this idea of putting on a school for politics. And so we replicated that here in the Chinese community. And we wanted to be absolutely certain, as I've said very many times, if you're a Swede and want to run for office, you'd better have the Swedish club on your side, because they're the ones that know you best and so forth. So if you're Chinese, you better have the Chinese in your favor. The only trouble there were only 4,000 or 5,000 Chinese in the area. We wanted to make them think that there were hundreds of thousands of Chinese here. But if all of the Chinese in Seattle, including the babes in arms, had voted for Wing, statistically it wouldn't have shown up in the pictures. because there were very few. But we got them all. Every single Chinese business in the Pacific Northwest had a Wing Luke sign in it, prominently displayed.
Right.
They all wore badges, Wing Luke.
And did you, it's my impression, I don't know if this is true or not, that Wing Luke took a leave of absence from his work as an assistant attorney general to run for city council. And so was he a full-time candidate for some period of time? In other words, was he campaigning all day long, or did he have some other work he was doing on the side?
No, he did absolutely nothing. But
I see. Okay, so I thought I had read
him
that
working from 9 o'clock in the morning until 12 o'clock at night.
Okay, and so about how long of a period, do you have a sense of how long he was essentially a full-time candidate? Was that about what month that might have started for the campaign, where he was?
I would imagine 3 months.
Yes.
The election was in February, I believe, and so we would have been working in November.
Sure.
And,
sure. And for Wing Luke, his election, of course, it was historical in many respects for an Asian American to be elected at that level of an office.
there was no one on the West Coast that had, but very shortly after they started.
And do you think he had much of a, did he ever talk about that aspect of it, either during the campaign or when it was over, or the sense of how important that his campaign, his running for office and successfully running for office, what that meant beyond his own election, but in a larger sense for the Seattle community or the state or even nationwide?
That's what it was all about. Particularly for me, Wing was a politician. He liked running for offices. He liked to hold offices. He liked to be running the show. I was not much interested in that. I've never run for office, never would.
There's still time, sir.
But the idea for me was, my background in race relations at the university was to drag these various minorities, just drag them into the political world, because I still believe that that's the only way they really are going to go. They're not going to make it by just being nice people.
Right. And during the course of the campaign, how would you describe him? You obviously were spending a lot of time with him every day. How would you describe him during the campaign? Here's what I'm getting at is, you've known him as a friend for many years, before there was the stress of a campaign. And campaigns can be extraordinarily stressful. There's so much scrutiny, and he was running a historical campaign in many respects. I suspect he faced a good deal of racism over the course of the campaign as well. I'm just curious how you saw him sort of in those quiet times, right, away from the cameras or the reporters, when maybe just the two of you were talking about the campaign day. How did he handle that stress of a campaign? Did he revel in it? Did he have really tough days? Maybe just talk about maybe quiet conversations the two of you had during that campaign with all the stress that must have been going on.
During the day, he would give no evidence of that. He was the happy warrior.
Okay.
But when we'd come back together in the evening and talk about it, he expressed a great deal of angst. As a matter of fact, it's unbelievable to tell you this, but one time he became so angry that he took his right fist and right through a wall. I mean, it was not wood anyway, and so he didn't break anything. But he had a powerful right arm, which he claimed was because in his youth he ironed so many clothes in the laundry. And I don't know whether that was true or not, but he had he was a very strong person. It always annoyed me one time when our good friend Lou Guzzo wrote, referring to him as that little guy. Wing was not little. He was powerful, strong, and vigorous.
Yes.
He was no little guy.
Do you recall what caused him to lose his temper, that incident?
No, I don't.
Interesting.
But the stresses that were put on us, mostly, that I remember more, were not racial, but were political. The famous case in which Terry Pettis, oh gosh, I forgot his name. Terry Pettis was the publisher and editor of a newspaper, and I've forgotten what it was called, but it was a local communist paper. Now, Terry always said it wasn't, but it was. And he wrote an article pointing out quite correctly that Wing had helped to picket and the waterfront against ships coming from China because of the, I don't know what the issues were at the time. But, and then Terry seemed to imply that Wing then was a communist. And boy, both the Times and the PI just loved to get hold of that. Stub Nelson, who was always trying to get something going like that, and Lyle Burt of the Times. And so they began to write, and Wing, we had a difficult time with Wing because he didn't want to appear to be anti-left-wing, because he felt himself a left-winger in a way, a liberal. And so that was where his stress was coming. I handled it in quite a different way because I knew the principles involved, the newspaper people, and most importantly, I knew the publisher. I've forgotten which one of the Bethans it was at the time, and I knew he was a very decent, nice guy. So I went to Bethan and talked to him about it. And so he stopped Albert from writing these things. And with the PI, we had a woman, I wish I could remember her name. She was a marvelous old-time writer, and she took up Wing's cudgels in this case. And stopped the PI from doing it.
And can you maybe describe what a typical campaign day would have been? I don't know if campaigns were much different back in those days than they are today. You know, was there much doorbelling? Was it meeting with voters who are gathering for a lunch somewhere through a club or an organization? Maybe you just talk through what a typical day. How much was on the phone dialing, asking for donations? Can you recall what might have been a typical day in the campaign? Yeah,
the principal thrust was not doorbelling. As a matter of fact, I was quite convinced that was a waste of time.
Too big a city, essentially.
Exactly. The city council campaigns. Right. I think you doorbelled in our area.
On the county council. We have districts on the county council.
I think you probably doorbelled us.
That's probably
shaking your hand.
That's my wife teases me. She says a week doesn't go by where someone doesn't come up to us in a coffee shop and say, "You knocked on my door 10 years ago." Yeah.
Well, that was very good in those campaigns because they were segmented.
Yes.
Okay, but so what we did was we did an enormous number of coffee parties.
Okay.
I mean, we'd have 3, 4, 5 of them in the morning, and several more in the afternoon. And then in the evenings, of course, were for various political meetings. But it was those, I counted everybody that was there, and I totted them up and made certain that most of these people I figured were going to vote for Wing because he was just a real charmer.
In other words, if they saw him in action, if they had a chance to hear him speak and answer questions, that they'd be sold, so to speak. They'd become supporters.
I think one of the most amusing one was a woman that one thing said that she couldn't vote for him because he was just too glib. He just knew, all the answers.
Interesting.
And I said, yeah, well, you realize that even the very day that he was at your place, he already answered that same question 3 or 4 times. Yes. And he said he wasn't like one of our candidates who went on, who used to say, oh shucks, I'll tell you, the way I feel it, saying that 15 times in the election is not it. Wing answered the question.
And so for those copies, I'm curious to learn more about that. Would these have been people's homes, for example,
Yes,
then?
indeed, all of them were.
Okay, and what would be the range of the number of people who would appear for that? Like, give me a sense of a typical...
7 or 8.
7 or 8 people,
Yeah.
okay.
We've had more than that, but very seldom less than that. But they were mostly housewives.
Okay.
And of course, that was absolutely great. As in many campaigns, the women are the ones that solve it.
And so during those copies, and he would speak, he had a stump speech, I assume, that he
Oh,
would
yeah.
deliver? Okay, and then he would take questions, is that correct?
Right.
Were you asking for donations at those events, or was
No.
it strictly just a chance to meet folks?
No, we never asked for any,
Okay.
or expected it.
And how was he, maybe you just describe, someone like myself, I've read about him, but I've never seen a video of him giving a stump speech. I don't have a sense of him in
Which
action.
is a great tragedy.
Yes,
And then it was ever done because
Yes.
he was a great performer.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask, do you ever recall a camera in front of him, a video camera? Do you recall one? Okay, which is too bad. It would be, so I'm trying to get a sense of, for someone who perhaps never had a chance to actually see him as a candidate, just maybe just what he was like. I mean, what was his style? How would you describe him when he's in front of a group of those 7 or 8 voters and he's speaking about his campaign and answering questions? What was his style, for lack of a better way to describe
This
it?
is why that picture that I've mentioned that's in our library, or our home library, tells him as he was. He was in shirt sleeves, had a pen in his hand, he was writing, and there were papers spread out over there. And he looked up and he gave me this great big grin. And that was the way he did things. He charmed everybody. One of the best charming jobs, we were always looking for endorsements. This was enormously important to the newspapers. We had nailed the Times and the PI finally, and the only one left was the Argus, Phil Bailey. And Phil was a tough one because he would never give a clue as to what he was going to do. And we were tipped off one morning. What's her name? Maxine Cushing Gray, who was the arts editor for the Argus. And Maxine called me quite early in the morning, and she said, we had a morning meeting, and Phil indicated that he was going to endorse Dr. Aiken. And said, you better do something about this. So I immediately called Phil and I said, hey, we'd like to come by and chat with you. How about lunch? Came to lunch. We went on for 3 hours and Phil came out raving about this great guy, this wonderful person. Well, I knew he was going to do that because Wing simply was a very likable person. If we'd had time, he'd have gotten every single person in this community, no matter who they were or what their background was, they'd have been on his side.
Now, I'm going to ask you a tough question. So every candidate has their weaknesses, right? There's no perfect candidate out there. Was there any part of the campaign that you felt he was not as strong at, whether it's asking people for money, or was there some part of the campaign that you would say was not his strong suit? Because everything I've read is fantastic candidate, fantastic human being, but nobody's perfect. Was there anything that you were talking about saying,
oh no, Wing was perfect. Well, first of all, we never asked anybody ever for money.
Interesting. Where did those days go, huh? Yeah, that's...
Yeah, well, when you run a campaign, that's 1/10 of what, what's her name says you have to run a campaign, which is $100,000. We had $14,000. That was the
Total.
entire thing.
Total.
And most of that came from me and from his parents. And a few people contributed. The contribution is something which, unfortunately, I don't have any of the little red envelopes
that were used, yeah.
That used to be used, and they still are used for contributing to parties and that sort of thing. And a few of those came in. Some of them slipped under the door. Others went to Bill Wong, who was our finance chairman, and probably some from the gambling interests and that sort of thing, who knows. My argument was if you don't know where it came from, take it. And worry about it later when they start asking questions. But $14,000 is all we had. That seemed at the time to be an enormous amount, and people told us that nobody had ever spent that much money.
So for that time, that was actually a reasonable amount of money to have for a campaign. Interesting.
And I think it still would be if we were organized right and didn't have to do the television.
So was there any part of his campaign that was not his strong suit? Or they just didn't like? Maybe that's another way of asking. They just didn't enjoy some part of it.
I don't think so.
Okay.
Wing loved the whole process. He would love to be in an election campaign all the time because it was he could wave his arms. It's like Lowry. He never called anybody a liar. Nevertheless,
but he was an animated candidate.
He was, and I don't know if anybody ever paid any attention to what he said, that is, to the content of it. We seldom do when politicians are talking, but they got the idea. No, I can't think of anything. Occasionally, he did have people like that woman who were determined to find something wrong with him at all. But that's okay.
Sure. Sure.
That's the way it is.
That's the way it is.
And but I don't think Wing ever had any doubts as to his winning.
Interesting. I find that fascinating. I mean, that's before there were polls. You weren't doing any polls about the race, and he's going to be the first Asian American elected to such an office in the entire Northwest and even a greater geographical area. And yet, you don't think he did not doubt his success. He had that level of self-confidence in himself.
Yeah, I had not doubts exactly, but anxieties because I had no idea whether this community would accept.
Absolutely, but that'd be the question I would naturally have.
That we did not know.
Right.
And that, I think, was the greatest accomplishment, that we did prove that the community, it was open.
Absolutely.
And that's what we were looking for, an open community.
Yes. Now, do you remember election night?
Oh, yeah.
And was there a party that night?
No.
Interesting. There was not a gathering of a big crowd of folks that night?
Oh, no. No.
Really? Okay.
No.
Nowadays, that's part of the deal.
Yeah, the national elections, we always had big things, and I loved them and participated in them, and we'd take a hotel room and so forth. But we didn't do any of that. First of all, we didn't have any money.
Okay, fair enough.
And,
all right, fair enough.
And our headquarters was in the upper floor of a house that was owned by Wing's family, and the lower area was occupied by one of your lawyers that's still practicing, I hope, Alan Monroe.
Oh, no kidding.
And Alan and his family lived down below. And now, talking about people that were my mentors, Ed Monroe was my mentor, period. And so Alan offered to host us, and of course the family paid the rent because they owned the building.
On that room up,
That's right.
And would you remember where was that? Close to where we are right
yes, it's gone now, but it's on the 50th and University Way.
Oh, it was up in the U District?
Oh, yes.
On that corner. So I know that corner well. So which corner would that have been on there, on the 50th and University?
It would have been the northeast corner.
On the northeast, isn't the school, there's a school there?
The school's right across the street.
Right across the street.
That's where
That's right, that's on the northwest corner, so on the northeast corner. I'm with you, yeah, okay.
The school is where, of course, Wing went to school, and my wife went there with him.
I see.
At University Heights.
Yes. I had my first kickoff when I first ran for office at University Heights. So maybe there's a
Oh, very
yeah,
good.
Yeah, in the school we rented out a room, which I didn't. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah,
That's a good place.
that's
I
a good
like
place.
that.
Yeah, it's a wonderful spot.
It even smelled like a school.
It's true. It's true. So on election night, then there was not some big party, but you must have been with Wing, obviously.
Yeah, and all of our principal
Yes.
workers were there.
Do you recall where you gathered?
Right there.
Oh, it was there.
At the
Oh, sorry. Oh, I
headquarters,
see.
yeah.
At the campaign headquarters.
Yeah.
So you're
I remember
University
holed
District.
up in my office, and I wouldn't let anybody in. I was just hanging on the phone.
We're waiting for the returns to
Yeah.
come in. And so about how many folks would have been there that night, do you think? At that election
20
night?
at the most.
Okay, do you recall anyone else who was in the room? His family members? Do you recall who would have been there with you?
No, there were people from the League of Women Voters.
Okay.
Now, that's a subject which I've never mentioned in
Mhm.
these very much,
Mhm.
but the League of Women Voters were very important in that regard.
Mhm.
It was a woman by the name of Kitty Prince, whose husband was an attorney. He's gone now, and she is. But she did something for me that I wanted done, and I could not do it myself. I'm a great one for endorsements, and we had ads in the newspaper, and we take the entire column all the way down, filled with names, very carefully placed, so that the most prominently well-known ones would be either at the top of the list in the sections
Sure.
and at the bottoms.
Mhm.
And we wanted everybody that was of any importance at all in the community. And so the League of Women Voters came, and they said, what can we do? And I put them on the phone, and they started calling people.
Interesting.
All the doctors at the Children's Hospital, for example, and over and over again. And we had everybody in town was obviously for Wing Luke. I mean, who else? I
Right.
mean, there's nobody else in the race,
Right.
sort of thing.
Right.
And that's what they did. They also tried to give me a lot of advice. I was not taking advice from anybody anymore because I thought they were all wrong. And
It's hard to argue with the outcome, sir, right? Yeah. So you must have been doing something right.
well, yes, except that there's another story to that too. We were running in a way almost as a tandem with Lud Kramer, who used to be down there at Olympia. And Lud was a young Democrat, or a young Republican, and that's how we got acquainted with lots and lots of people in the community. And we ran together. Now, Lud had the Republicans, we had the Democrats, and when the election came out, we found that in spite of the fact that Lud didn't spend anything like as much money as we did, didn't have anything like the organization or the volunteers or anything like that, his vote's almost identical to Wing's. So that's a thing that sits in my mind very carefully. And every time I've ever talked to and advised any candidates that don't think your campaign has done all that great, but do it anyway.
Yes, do it, yes,
You have
yes,
to.
have to
You
anyway,
have to.
yes.
Because if you pick up one or two or
Absolutely.
three, that's better.
Yeah. So now on election night, do you recall the moment when Wing Luke realized he'd won? Do you recall that
No,
that
in
conversation
fact,
or his reaction?
I think that he was at home at that time. And that's when the famous picture
Yes.
of Betty,
Yes.
when she said, "We knew it all the time."
Right.
That's a great, great picture.
Mhm.
Betty was a marvelous woman, still is.
Mm-hmm.
And no, Nancy and I were together because we both shared the possibility that it wouldn't come out right. And it was amazingly close even then. Dr. Aiken shouldn't have gotten any votes.
Politics doesn't work that way, though, right?
No, and I noticed that in the the Virginia race yesterday. Cuccinelli should never have gotten
Very
any
close
votes
race.
at all.
But politics
He's a
works that way.
loathsome man.
Politics works that way. No matter how good you are, there's it's. So do you recall talking to Wing Luke about the election results? So the campaign's over. He's won. Do you recall just his reaction to winning? Was it relief? Was it excitement? Was it looking ahead to his days on the city council? What was
That's the word. He was immediately involved. He wanted to get onto that council right away. And of course, there was a space there,
Yes.
about a month or so,
Yes.
when he went to the Seattle World's Fair, because they just gave him a job, and, you know, as a bridge game.
Is that
Also
right?
Lud Kramer,
Uh-huh.
and eventually I went with him for the same reason.
Yes.
So they sat there. That's where we got acquainted with another attorney, Bob Ashley. I don't know if, did you never know about him?
I don't think so. Nothing I know.
That's too bad. He was quite a character.
Uh-huh.
And anyway, what we was doing then was just dreaming of and plotting what he was going to do when he got on the city council. But it was a very different city council then,
Yes.
and a very different political situation in the city. It was a much easier one in those days.
Right.
I was the assistant to a county councilman when there were three,
Oh, who was that? Who were you working
Bob
with?
Ford.
Okay.
And
This is during the time you were helping with the campaign. You had your on the day
That's right.
was on the county
and
council.
Bob wanted me to come full-time on the council.
I see.
And I did help him with his campaign, and he lost. But back in those days, when you saw something that needed to be done, you did it. You didn't have to go through environmental studies and all of this Seattle process that we go through. I'm not at all happy at all with the Seattle process in a way. For example, the Marymore Park. It came on just a little notice that they were going to be sold, and that the county could have a chance to develop. Bob Ford called me up and said, let's go out and take a look at it. We took a look at Marymore, and I described to him all the things we could do with it. They're doing them now, but we didn't have to do anything. He went back to the office, got the other two councilmen together, and they did it. They bought that property.
Yeah, different time.
And the same thing with the famous efforts over the years for the Save the Wawona and Save the Market.
Wing was very involved in both
deeply
those,
involved
yes.
with the market thing. As a matter of fact, much more creatively than people realize. Some of the best ideas were there. He and Bob Ashley. And I was in the periphery because I was a travel agent. You don't have all that much time. But, but I became the close associate with Vic Steinbrück. But those are the things, Wing would do them. For example, he was driving around the town and he noticed that there were all these street ends that nothing was done about. And maybe occasionally the city would come by and mow the lawn. And he said, well, why don't we make these official parks? They are now official parks all over this town. And it didn't take anything. He just said, let's do it. And council said, okay, let's do it. Now, can you imagine?
Time. Yeah. So a couple more questions before maybe we'll take a short break. But just going back to Wing Luke just as a person, I know you've described this in the past, but I thought since we have a chance to have this conversation and it's being recorded, I guess I'd enjoy, and I think others would enjoy, just hearing you work so intimately with him for such a long period of time. How would you describe him as a person? The key qualities that you saw, and you think others saw in him as a person?
Well, he was just fantastically interested in everything, and as Ruth Chin once said, he was the intellectual of the community. Well, I suppose so. He read, and not many people read in those days, apparently. Actually, they all did. But he and I read constantly. It's a very important part of Wing to remember that he was not part of this Chinese community. He was not known at all in the community. His father was, because he was active in his Tong and that sort of thing. But Wing was not. He was Roosevelt. He was University Heights. He was John Marshall, Roosevelt, and the University of Washington. And all his friends were Lofan. And they, several of the people, the younger people in the Chinese community all used to say, well, he's not Chinese, he's not Chinese. And so we tried to change that. First of all, I was so interested in the Chinese community, much more so than Wing was, and I got him into it, and I started finding him books. There was only one book, and I still don't know what the name of it was, but written by a doctor in San Francisco, and it was about the Chinese on the West Coast. And that was the only one that there was. Now there are hundreds and hundreds of them, and some of them even quite good. But we had to teach ourselves. That's why Joe Locke became so important to me, because he took me in and we'd spend hours late at night, and he would talk to me about the businessmen and the community and how they came about. And then I discovered made the realization that the Chinese community, the way it was organized, was also the way in which a village in China, South China, that is, how they were organized. And that the same issues that they faced when they came to America were the issues which they had very well handled in China. Now we talk about Tongs and everything, and the Tong Wars and everything. That was an American thing. It was not Chinese. Those organizations don't exist in China. But they did here as a substitute for the family groups, which were broken up in the process of immigration. And that's why you have so powerful in this community, the family groups. Right across the street here, Oak Tin, and one of the other family groups, the Chin family, has their own shrine and that sort of thing. Because it was organized for protection, organized so a community could exist without the pressure from the outside. Right. And this is why the only two people that seem to understand this most clearly and actively was Ping and Ruby Chow. They understood this, and they worked the community. They used to invite every member of the establishment, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, all to a big party every year. It was the social event of the year, I can tell you. It was glorious. So we decided that's what we would do. So Ruby, bless her, put on this magnificent party. And we had everybody. We had the governor. Sure. We had county commissioners, all of them. But we had the mayor and everybody came to that party. And then we invited the elders of the Chinese community to come and see that Wing was endorsed by everybody, by the whole community, with these big wheels. And I'll tell you, that really brought them around. They understood that we were making
Yes.
a push.
Yes. And what other qualities would you say? Obviously, highly intelligent, very well read, relatively young man at the time, obviously.
Well, he was deeply religious. He was a Baptist, and he'd have been just as religious if he'd been any other religion, but that happened to be the church that he went to, and he became very active in it, and the YMCA.
Which church specifically?
The Baptist
did you go
church.
to? Yeah.
Yeah, it was the Chinese Baptist church was his church, but he was involved nationally, as a matter of fact. He was on the board of the national.
And did he have a sense of humor? What was his sense of humor like?
Oh, he was fantastic. I mean, he was laughing all the time. We had great times. And we had a little group. It was Bob Ashley and Pat Belargen and what's her name, Bullet, Harriet, and Nancy and I, and often Bud Kramer and his wife, until Bud had problems with his wife, so they dropped out.
Yeah.
But we were together almost every weekend, and it was just one hilarious thing.
Interesting.
Wing was a great chef. I think he learned part of his chef abilities back in Washington, D.C., because where he lived with a cousin who was the chef at the Chinese embassy, which was the Kuomintang embassy at the time. And he learned cooking in a real professional way. I remember him being in the kitchen in our house and teaching my mother how to make wonton. Even when they went back to Iowa, she was still making wonton for people.
Is that right? That's great. So why don't we do this? Why don't we take a short break, if that's okay with you?
Yeah.
And we can come back and have a few more questions. But it's been an enjoyable conversation so far. We'll take a short break and come right back.
Very good.
And during the break, you handed me some interesting literature from the campaign, which I want to chat about, which I think is new to the museum as well, potentially. But before that, during the break, you were chatting about the museum itself and the Wing Luke Museum, of course, and where we're conducting this interview. And you also talked about you had a chance to go back to look at your interview, the transcript of your interview with Mr. Chu from 1991, and you spoke a little bit about your reaction when you were reading that, just I assume the last few days, going back and reflecting back on the interview and your time with Wing Luke. And do you mind sharing what your reaction to that was?
Well, in going over it, what was most emotionally involved with me was the realization of what, not exactly lost, but that it stopped. We did have a lot of things that we were planning and thinking about and so forth. I very deliberately organized this thing, and through Wing, because he had the contacts, but we went in and talked to the offices of almost every agency in the government, so that we knew what we were doing, what were these people, what their problems. And they always said, well, nobody has ever talked to us before about this, they don't know. One of our old friends that we got on that time was the fire chief. I've got his name down here somewhere, but he was quite a famous fire chief, and he's the one that told us about the tunnels and the old the businesses that were covered up when they changed the level of the town. And we suggested that the tourists would be interested in this. And of course he thought that was a great idea, and of course now we have our underground tours. And it was that kind of thing that there would have been, if Wing had continued on, there had been all sorts of funny things that would have happened. Because that's just the way my mind works, it's the way Wing's mind worked.
Yes.
And we also went out into the community. We had talks with the Boeing people and a number of the industrialists down here, trying to get well acquainted with them. And it was partly political in that it was nice to have these people know us. They may not agree with us, but they at least would know us and not think of us as the enemy.
Absolutely.
And that's very important in politics. And I wish it were still important, but we try to make everything adversarial. And actually, among the people that I most admired in politics were Joel Prichard, who was no relation of mine, but we knew each other at the university. As a matter of fact, he and I debated on the university's radio station one time, and they loved that because here was Prichard and Prichard,
Right.
and I pointed out that Joel played his name with a T.
Yes, he spelled it differently than you
And
did.
that I let him do that Republicans, T. If you're a Democrat, you take the T out. But of course, the original one was without the T.
Yes.
That's,
So now you handed me a few things during our break. I'm
Yeah.
going to hand back to you and maybe just have you chat about while we look at them. And this is a little bit of campaign literature that looks like it was used during the campaign. So first, looks like it's sort of maybe the stationery for the campaign there, Wing Loop for
Yes.
Seattle City Council.
Yeah, it
And let me
was.
just sort of take it piece by piece. The photograph.
Oh, yeah.
Did you recall the photograph? Where
Oh,
that was
yes.
taken or who took it? Or
yes, as a matter of fact, it's taken by one of his classmates
Oh,
at Roosevelt,
Really?
who had a photographic studio in the University
Is
District.
that right? You don't recall that person's name by any chance, do you?
I probably would if I
Okay.
thought about it for a
Okay.
long time.
Fair enough. But it was in the University District. He had a studio and was a
That's
friend
right.
of Wing's, presumably from
That's
school.
right. And the family likes this picture. I do too. It's a very good one, and it kind of looks like Wing. But my picture is much closer because it's the real
Sure. A more
animated
casual,
person,
yes.
you
A more
know.
casual one.
And
Absolutely.
but they feel that it wasn't dignified enough.
I see. Now on this
And I
this
agree.
photograph, yeah, and on this photograph, so was this was one that was used officially for the campaign? I feel like
Yeah.
I've seen this in newspaper articles as
Oh,
well.
yes.
And was there a campaign slogan?
No.
Okay. And this looks like this was, I'm not sure if there's a date on this, but it has at the bottom highlights from Wing Luke's activities. It mentions high school, college, military service, civic service, and business career. We've sort of touched a little bit on many of those. One I did want to ask you about was his military service. You're a veteran yourself, is that?
Yes,
Is that right?
I didn't actually know about his military service at all until he got the award. I guess the Bronze
You
Star.
received the Bronze Star, as I
It
understand,
came
yes.
much later. It was, I don't know why it was
Interesting.
delayed, but he did not receive it. But he received it sometime when we were back in Washington.
I see. Did he speak much about his military service?
No. Very, very little.
Okay.
And in fact, I would absolutely know nothing about it.
Okay. And then just taking these in order, going back to high school, of course you mentioned he was at Roosevelt High School.
Yep.
And as it mentions here and is well known, he was obviously an excellent student. He was student body president there.
He was indeed.
and,
He was president of everything
Yeah,
he did.
I was gonna get to that. And one thing I wanted to ask you, mention that was student body president of high school, and obviously we know of his career on the Seattle City Council. And did he ever talk to you about what his long-term political ambitions were? Did he keep that to himself, or did he ever talk to you about in politics where he might want to go someday?
No, not, well, yes, we talked about actually all the time. We never expected that the city council would be the end of it. I always imagined the governorship, and was surprised and pleased that Gary came along and picked that one off.
Yes.
And I think well, that was a very important thing. When Gary ran for the county council thing, I went with him one day at the Lake City parade time, And I went through that entire parade holding a great big sign over his head.
Is that right?
As he went on shaking
Is that
hands
right?
with
Yes.
everybody. And what amazed me at that time, and I began to realize and take him very seriously, that practically everybody in that audience, that you couldn't go more than 10 steps before someone had been in high school with him, or knew something, or had this or that, and so forth. And he remembered them all.
Interesting.
And
yeah. Of course, around like Gary Locke, who was running for county executive at the time and later became governor. And then so did Wing Luke himself speak about his political ambitions, or were those that you had and others had for him, realizing he was obviously such an outstanding person and politician, or did he ever himself talk about someday what he might like to achieve in politics?
No.
Okay, he kept that to himself.
yeah,
Interesting. And now it looks like he was running for position number 5. I seem to recall there were 2 open seats maybe on the city council then. I'm not sure
that's
if I
right.
had this right. Okay.
Bud Kramer was running in the other one.
Okay, and did you recall much about the decision to run for this particular spot, or was there much?
Because it was open.
Okay, just simply an open seat, and that was
Yeah.
the way to go. Okay.
Yeah.
Now I've noticed in here the letter refers to the Wing Luke. It's a letter from you, by the way, director of the campaign committee. It says the Wing Luke for City Council campaign for position number 5 on the Seattle City Council is in full gear and underway. Spacious and convenient headquarters have been established at 5012 and a half University Way. That's the location you were chatting about earlier.
Yeah.
And that's where you had the election night gathering, is that right?
Yeah.
So you were equipped with typewriters. This is the age well before personal computers
Well,
or
as a matter
phone
of fact,
devices.
all the typewriters came from the last campaign that Hugh B. Mitchell conducted.
Interesting.
And I've forgotten who he was running against for, or what office it was.
But they were donated to,
But I was in his campaign. I had a campaign headquarters in the University District, and I got from him these 2 typewriters,
No kidding.
which eventually I donated to the Black Panthers.
No kidding. Okay, so they had quite a history, it sounds like, right? Telephones, desks, staple guns, and Bob Ford's mimeograph machine.
That's right. That was a good mimeograph machine.
And then it says literature and bumper strips will appear at the end of the week. I mean, bumper strips like for vehicles, bumper stickers. Were those ever produced, bumper stickers?
I think we had a few,
Okay,
but the printers of that sort of thing demand money.
absolutely.
And that's our big problem. The thing that we innovated with was we were the first people to put a political ad on the side of a bus.
Is that a fact?
Or when people woke up one morning and on all the major lines with these great, big, huge signs, enormous, 6, 7 feet long.
And did you have a photograph of Wing in those, or was it just?
I probably have somewhere, but Betty was particularly impressed with that.
Interesting.
To see her big buzzer, you know,
on the side of the bus?
side of a bus.
I can
That
believe
was
it.
quite exciting. And of course, when you're the first, you do get a lot of attention.
Absolutely.
And
And it looks like there was literature as well, so some kind of brochure that could be handed out, perhaps at coffees and that type of thing?
yeah, not much.
Okay.
Although I'll try to find some for you.
Okay.
But what the literature did was to, first of all, list the endorsements and the things that Wing had done and so forth. There were no issues. At some point in this interview, Warren asked if what were the issues of the campaign. He said there weren't any. As far as I know, no one talked about issues. First of all, Dr. Aiken wouldn't have known anything about the issues. He simply knew nothing about city government or what the issues were. And we didn't bother to raise them because what we were pushing was this guy, this candidate. And if the issues were involved, well, people raised the question.
Absolutely. At those coffees,
And
he
that
clearly
was-
was open to answering questions of any kind.
That was fine. I notice that very few of the campaigns nowadays talk about issues either. They pretend like they do, but they don't. They're about families and
Sure.
that sort of thing.
There was one issue that I know he became involved in on the city council related to housing.
Yes.
And and open housing. I know that as an assistant attorney general, he was involved in a case that went up to the state Supreme Court, that his client as an assistant attorney general was, we now call it Human Rights Commission. It had a different name at the time, which has just momentarily escaped me. But I understand from his sister that he may have argued that case before the state Supreme Court. Does that ring a bell? By any
It's
chance?
possible.
Okay. Okay.
That I'm sure was one of the Unitarian Church involved in up in Wedgwood.
Yeah, there was one case, I actually have a copy of it here, in which, I'm not sure if it's the same case, where there was, on the sale of a home, a couple would not sell their home, I believe, to an African-American couple.
Oh, no, I don't know.
And that's the case that went up to the state Supreme Court. I believe Wing argued it. We're trying to confirm that. And the Supreme Court went against the state and against Wing Luke, 5-4. So obviously, the state's position was that was discriminatory and violated the law. And so I just was curious, so he would have had, he was very involved in that case and would have lost a very close decision at the state Supreme Court on open housing and discrimination housing. He obviously took that with him in some way to the Seattle City Council because he obviously was a primary driver of open housing law. I just was curious if you talked much about housing issues or open housing and discrimination in housing in your time with him.
I wonder if that might have been the case that Byron Coney was involved with, because when we had this little meeting of the museum, they got into quite an argument about this. Coney felt that Durning and the others, and there were several of them there, that they were wrong, that they took the wrong approach. He said, if you'd done it my way, we'd have won. So if they lost, that must have been it.
So the case was, in case it jogs your memory, it was from 1961, September of 1961. Yeah. So it would have been, he must have been thinking about his campaign. At that point, he would have been on his mind that he might be leaving the office to run for city council, because the campaign was in, the election was March of 62, if we have our months and years right. So it's O'Meara versus Washington State Board against, does that ring a bell?
I remember, yeah.
Interesting.
But I don't remember his talking to me about it.
Interesting. Interesting. And do you recall that on his time on the city council, I know before his very untimely passing, he was heavily involved in pushing for open housing. Did you ever talk to him about that, or do you recall much of him speaking about it?
Yeah, well, we were very interested in this open housing thing, because my theory always was, and I think he shared this, that to do that sort of thing, you had to push. You couldn't just let things happen, let people move. You have to move them. Say, hey, this is the law, and so that would have been part of it, and a real affirmative action sort of thing.
That's interesting, because and you recall anything specifically more he would have said about whether it's open housing generally or civil rights more generally? That I mentioned what you're saying about his approach of saying you've got to push for these things. You can't just simply wait for these things to happen or to take a natural course of some kind. That you've got to be pushing on these issues. Do you recall him speaking anything more specifically about that?
Well, not in any specific case, as far as I know. It was a general proposition that we had. He was a member of, although he didn't participate a great deal with the ACLU, but...
And he clearly lived that in his own life, and running for office, what he did was something as well.
Well, they'd had, the family had problems, not necessarily presented as anti-Chinese or anything, but his family lost their business in the University District through, they simply raised the rates, and that was their right at that time. And
how do you think that affected Wing Luke?
I think it affected him tremendously, because, see, he was taken out of the Army, had to come home to help them get a new location and so forth. And that was a very traumatic experience for him. And so I think that he saw in my attitude of don't give him an inch, let's go get him. They had problems when they moved even to the area in which they were locating. But I don't remember the specifics of how any of these things came out, because again, I was not there to follow all the way through the issues.
And where do you
Betty
suppose?
knows about this sort of thing because
Absolutely.
she was then a teenager and in high school, so
Yes.
she knew what was going on.
And where do you suppose, or maybe he spoke about, maybe Wing-Luke spoke about, he obviously must have been an unusual man in many respects, to do the things he did at a time that must have been difficult on many levels. And did he ever talk about where he felt those qualities that allowed him to push in that way, where they came from? Did he ever talk about the major influences in his life to get to where to put him in a position to accomplish what he accomplished, besides his own hard work, obviously?
That's
his
a
own
very
ability.
interesting question, because I don't know that everything seemed, I think it seemed to Wing as if it all came quite naturally. When he was at his first school there at University Heights, when he toddled off to that school, he didn't speak English really at all. No, as he used to say, the first words I learned were, he hit me first. And Nancy doubts that, but nevertheless, he was in a situation where either you moved ahead and did it, or you just, you faded away.
But many folks choose the fading away, or
I
choose
know,
not to push. So I guess I'm trying to get, did he ever
and
talk about?
I don't know exactly why he chose what there was about it. He certainly didn't learn it from my brother-in-law. Nancy never talked to him about it.
Yeah, and he never spoke. He never really spoke about that part of it, as far as you know. And I guess something I mentioned earlier, but curious to come back to, is that did you ever sense any? I'm not sure what the right word is really, but did he have any doubts about the path that he had? Did he ever have any? Because it must have been a stressful thing, right? To be running for a public office, to be a leader that he was in the way he was, to be pushing in the way that you suggest. That's never an easy thing for anybody, no matter how self-confident you are. No matter how self-confident you are, we're all human at the end of the day. And did he ever? I'm just curious if he ever spoke about that in any way with you.
No.
It was always he always was confident.
Always was confident. Always, everything seemed to be quite natural. We thought this campaign was quite natural and all. It was just something that one did, and you figured out how to do it. And no, Wing didn't have any doubts. When we went back to Washington, not together, but we were there all the time together. We were every weekend. We gathered our group together. We sort of organized the Democratic Party group back there. Some of them don't remember this, but the parties that we gave, Wing and I did it, and we put those things together. And so he was a leader everywhere, always, because again, if there's a problem, go ahead and solve it.
Sure.
Don't wring your hands and worry about it.
Yes.
And what impressed me with this interview was, gosh, the things that we could have done. And I think community would have been even better.
Well, let's chat about that for a minute. I was going to wait a few more minutes for bringing that up, but obviously, Wing-Luke, of course, had a very tragic passing in a plane crash at a very young age. Really, just when his political career was really just getting underway. And do you mind if I ask you how you got the news about the plane crash?
Oh yes. Well, first of all, I didn't. Dr. Redgold and I were on the Trans-Siberian Railroad heading this way.
No kidding.
And that takes 10 days.
Right.
So he was lost about the first of those days. And Nancy had the problem is, should she try to get in touch with me and tell me? And then Bob and she said, well, what the hell? He can't do anything about it. Let's let it come. And so when they arrived here at SeaTac, Nancy and Bob Ashley picked me up at the airport, and in the course of the ride into town, he told me, well, my point was, after 10 days, I knew the mountains over here.
Mm-hmm.
I knew a little bit about flying airplanes.
Mm-hmm.
They were gone.
Mm-hmm.
That was it.
Mm-hmm.
And but I don't know what I'd have done if I'd been here.
Mm-hmm.
I'd have been up in the mountains, of course,
Mm-hmm.
climbing around.
Searching. Mm-hmm.
I did participate in some of the groups at the urging of Betty, but there was nothing could be done. We were not looking for them anymore. They were looking for bodies.
Mm-hmm.
The Chinese like to have a body that they can bury, and Sid Gerber's religion was exactly the same. That is, the Jews have got to have the
Mm-hmm.
body, and they can't rest until they find it. And that's what the emphasis was at that point.
I see.
And we know little about Kayla Du and her family because she had no family out here.
Mm-hmm.
She was quite a wonderful woman, but we knew very little about her.
I saw, I think it was at the downtown library, I did not bring a copy with me, but I think the program from the services for Wing Luke, which were held downtown, I believe.
At the Opera House.
I think that's right. I think
Yeah.
that's right. So I've seen the program for that, and I think it's at the Seattle Public Library. They have a file there on Wing Luke, and I believe I saw it there. Do you recall the services?
Well, I attended them.
Mm-hmm.
I had nothing to do with them because I was in Europe at the time.
Oh, is that right?
I just had arrived back.
I see.
Just in time for the thing. And so I don't
Mm-hmm.
really remember anything about it.
And when you say you've spoken about it a few times about what was lost with Wing Luke's death, and maybe you can speak a bit more detail about what you think that might have been more specifically.
Well, he'd have continued on with his politics because he was a politician and he loved it. And I thought that he probably would have gone for the governorship because that would have been available and would have been possible. And I already had his cabinet worked out in my mind.
You were always thinking ahead about that, weren't you? That doesn't surprise me, I think.
Well, the governor's office, in fact, anything you guys do down there at Olympia is utterly fascinating and extremely, even more complex than it was then. John O'Donnell, is that his name?
O'Connell, Attorney General from 1956 to 68.
It was the one that appointed Wing, and
Oh, that's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up. That's right, because
Yeah.
I think Wing was appointed 1957 as Assistant Attorney General.
Something like that,
I think
yeah.
that's right, and that would have been early on in Attorney General O'Connell's first term.
yeah. John's name is not on here, but I would suspect that he attended Ketchler's conferences also. But I didn't know, and I don't put on any things that I don't know.
Right.
But he, I wish some of the people from his group were still here. One fellow that was not his campaign, but his assistant, what's his name? Sorry, if I'd have thought about it, I'd have, I can usually think of these
You're doing
things.
pretty well with names from a lot of years ago.
O'Reilly, John O'Reilly. Does that name ring a bell?
No. He worked in the AG's office then?
Probably, but John was a veteran. He was a pilot, and I don't know in which war it was, but we called him Fighting John O'Reilly because some idiot that was trying to run one of his campaigns came up with this Fighting John. Didn't work.
Right.
But he was a good man nevertheless.
Good.
And And if he were here, he could tell you all of these things. And he was a good friend of Wing's.
So one question before we wrap up, but one thing I did want to ask, we're having the interview here at the Wing Museum, and you know the museum well, of course. And do you have any thoughts about the museum that you'd like to share?
Well, I think that it is accomplishing just what I would have hoped, but not at all what we had talked about earlier, because it never occurred to us to anything to be a Chinese museum. In Chinatown, this was Chinese, and it was only after the museum got started that it began to realize that it was the Asian experience. Now, in my own studies, and I'm reading at this moment about the early developments of the various communities that make up Southeast Asia, and realized that they're all essentially the same culture, because they're faced with the same problems. When you come to America as an immigrant, you're going to face pretty much the same experiences that the Irish, the Poles, the Germans, the English even faced, and that we need museums that express that rather than having a lot of artifacts and things. I love artifacts. That's why I go to museums to look at them. But on the other hand, it isn't interpreted in terms of the lives of the people that use those artifacts. And that's what this museum has done almost from the beginning. So that's what the museum means to me, and I think it needs to be twice the size it is. And
we'll work on that.
I was talking to a woman some time ago. They were interviewing me in connection with the World's Fair, and I asked her if she'd gone to the museum. Of course, she's a regular at the museum, but I said, well, what do you think of it? She says, it's not big enough. It should be twice that size. And I said, well, we can buy that building over there, but I have to win the lottery first.
Sure, all right. So one question I realized I jotted a note down to ask you, and maybe I've asked you indirectly, but just wanted to ask it another way perhaps, and that is that I think for any politician, when you run for office, much is written about you by reporters and gets placed in the newspapers, but it's hard for a reporter to really accurately capture a person, right? I just was curious from your perspective during that campaign of what was written about Wing Luke during the campaign, or what was said about him that was out there publicly. Was there anything about him privately that you felt was different in any way from the public persona? Was there anything about him privately that that didn't always come through on the public persona or was written about Wing Luke?
I think that there never was the realization at how expansive his life was and his reach. He had a phrase always that was about the greater community, and I didn't really know what the hell he was talking about at that point, but I realize now, we live in our private lives and we in our community and so forth, but then there is that greater world outside. And actually, one of the phrases was, some great woman was asked by some woman, what should an ordinary person do when they're faced with all these problems? And this person answered, you must expand your family. Now, to some people means that you should have a bunch of babies. But in fact, what she was talking about was to bring other people into your family and to be concerned about the rest of the people. Wing was deeply concerned about the rest of the community and the people in it. He always was. The way he would talk to you when you were, and I watched him with I was about to say patience, but with the electorate, he was right there. We'd say in your face, but he was always listening and thinking in terms of how you and he fit into the community. Once again, the experience of the community is what this museum is about. And it's the experience of human beings that really counts. It's why I think that public opinion polls get it wrong so often, is because they are asking people to have an opinion about a thing. But most of the time we don't have an opinion, we simply experience it. We like our parks, we experience our parks, but we don't exactly think of them as an issue.
Right.
And Wing always did. And again, this museum is unique in the world. No wonder that it has the reputation that it has.
Absolutely.
Beth, because it is concerned about the experience of people and the experience, particularly of the young people that are still coming. They're experiencing this museum and experiencing what is happening. And this is going to be very, very good for this world.
Absolutely. I'm just going to ask you a follow-up on that greater community. So that was something he spoke about during his campaign?
Yes.
What was like part of a stump speech, for example? That was part of his message, was concern for the greater community?
It was a thing that I think came out of his YMCA work.
Interesting.
Because that's the first time I ever heard him use it.
Interesting.
And that's why he was interested in the politics. The very first time I met him, within seconds, when I had been asked to go on to the board of the YMCA and to do a political thing, and he sat down with me and leaning forward, and he wanted to know what I had in mind. And of course, it was our school politics that we had in mind. And so it was concern always about the community, because that's, you know, that's where we live. It's why I get so annoyed nowadays, the attitude toward politics, as if a politician is something apart. But politics is how we govern ourselves. And it's the only excuse that it has. And that's why the Tea Party people are going to lose, because they do not take it that way. They think that politics is some way in which I will get what I want. And that's never been right. We never get exactly what we want.
So, Ken, this has been a fascinating interview. And one thing I'll say is that, having run for office myself, anyone who runs for office knows that you're not going to be successful unless you have a very good campaign manager. That's a fact. And everybody knows that. And so, while Wing Luke was obviously an individual and a politician of uncommon ability, clearly, you know, your dedication to him as a campaign manager and as a friend over those years played an essential part in his success and his contribution. So I want to thank you for that. And then also want to ask you, do you have anything else you just wanted to add that perhaps I didn't ask about, that you want to add about Wing Luke or your experience with him?
Well, several hours of it, yes.
Well, maybe we'll get another opportunity
there
to do
were
this
many
then.
issues. But it was, the things that I'm most interested in looking back over there is the way in which we involved the Chinese community and the success that was. I hadn't fully realized that until I read the thing, the interview, and I think, gosh, did I say all those things? Did I believe those things? I do now, but I'm amazed that, when was it,
1991, you did that interview. So it's been a generation ago now. Yeah, it's been a generation ago.
And but we thank Beth and all of the people involved with the museum, and stick with it.
And it is a wonderful, it's a wonderful museum, and also a wonderful way to remember Wing Luke, and to, because as time passes, there can be a tendency to forget those who came before and their contributions, but one wonderful thing about the museum, of many wonderful things, is his name that's attached to it. And I've always found him to be someone of great, someone I could really admire, both as a lawyer and also as a politician. And I'm very proud as Attorney General that he spent nearly 5 years in our office as an Assistant Attorney General. In fact, I'm giving a speech tomorrow to all of our attorneys. We're having a conference tomorrow, down in Tacoma. And we do this every so often. It's been a number of years, but we're doing it tomorrow. So I'll be speaking about a few of our Assistant Attorneys General from the past in our office. And one of the three that I'm highlighting is Wing Luke. And I'll be mentioning our conversation today. And but I think it should be it should be more well known to, for example, the attorneys and staff in our office, that Wing Luke was in our office. He was very involved in significant cases that went all the way before the state Supreme Court, and then his contributions to our community and our state after he left the office of the Attorney General. So he's a real role model for all of us in our office as well. So
That's
again,
great.
yeah. So again, I want to thank you for your time. You've been very generous with your time. You have an impressive memory. I think we can all agree with the details of your time with Wing Luke, and perhaps we can do this again sometime.
Thank you very
Thank you
much.
again. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, enjoyed it.